In this video, we're going to create the courses page for our student CompSci ASP.NET web application. So what I'm going to do is right click on CompSci Starter, and I'm going to add a new item. I'm going to add a web form, and I'm going to call it Courses. And I'm calling it Courses because the links in our master page and elsewhere point to a file called courses.aspx. So you notice that I've got both the boxes checked here, place code in separate file and select master page. I'm going to click add. I'm going to choose my CS master page master file so that this page has all the styles and headers and footers and so forth. So I'm going to say OK. And I get a content page. So if I take a look at it, pardon me, it looks like this. So I have two content areas, the sidebar and my main content area. So what I want to do in this case is I want to connect to my CompSci database that we took a look at in a previous video, showed you how to create that from the script, and also how to authenticate the user as a SQL Server user. So I'm going to place on my main content area from the toolbox, and specifically from the data area of the toolbox, a grid view control. So I'm dragging and dropping a grid view. I'm not going to do anything special with it. And I'm going to drag and drop also from the toolbox another one of these data controls called a SQLDataSource control. I'm going to drag and drop this anywhere in my content area because it's not going to show up at runtime. It's invisible at runtime, but it's very powerful because what it does is it acts as a data adapter, a data set, it acts as a connection, and it allows you to very quickly and easily connect to a SQL Server database or any database for that matter and dump the contents of that database or bind the contents of that database to any control in the toolbox that has a data source ID property. And if we take a look at the properties of this data grid, you'll see that it does have a data source ID property right down here, which we're going to connect up in just a second. So the first thing we're going to do is go to this SQL data source, and I'm going to click on its little smart tag right here and go to where it says configure data source. So at this point, this asks me which connection do I want to use to connect to my database. And I want to connect to my CompSci database that's on my local SQL server. And it happens that I do have a connection to that, but I'm going to create a new one just in case you don't. I'm going to create a new connection, and it brings up this very familiar looking interface. So I'm going to choose my server name, and I have actually two SQL servers, so I want to choose the proper one. I'm going to wait for this to populate, and it should any second now here. And I need to choose my SQL Server 2012 server. So when I do that, I'm going to choose my server, which is this guy right here. And I'm going to use SQL Server authentication because that's how we set up our CompSci database in the previous video. So my username was, I believe, CompSci 2015, and my password. And I'm going to, if it authenticates me, whoops, darn it. So let's see. Let's try that password. And there we go. So that was the correct password. So there's CompSci Winter 2015. Pardon me. And I don't really need to test connection, but I will anyway. And I'll say OK. So now, as soon as this is done, it's going to connect to CompSci Winter 2015, and I can see the connection string here if you wish to see it. I'm going to click Next. Now this asks you, do you want to save the connection in the application configuration file? That would be the web config. And I'm going to say yes. And this is going to be the name of my connection in the web config file in the connection strings area. And I can change that if I want, but I'm just going to let it default to that because it's fine. So I'll say next. So now I have an opportunity to choose. You notice it says specify the columns from a table or view, so I'm going to just do that. And I have an opportunity to choose whatever table I want in that database. So I'm going to choose classes since this is the courses page. And the columns, I can select asterisk, which is great. There aren't many columns. I want all of these because I just want to show students what classes we offer and what major they're associated with and so on. So I'm just going to say next. And I can test the query to see what data I'm going to get back. And you can see this is the data that's in the database that I'll get back. So I can say finish. And my data source, as soon as the little hourglass goes away, is finished configuring itself. So what I can do is go to the source of my page, and I can separate all of these little guys out, and you can see that what's happened is I have a connection to my comp sci winter 2015 connection string. And if I take a look at my web config file, lo and behold, there is, as soon as I close all these windows, there is that connection, comp sci winter 2015. It actually created it for me in the web config file, so I don't have to do that. It did the work for me of creating that connection in the web config file. So if I want to use it again, say in a middle tier or someplace else, I've already got a connection string. I've got a connection. So that's really handy. So in the source, this is what it looks like. And so now all I need to do is take this SQLDataSource control, and actually I can name it here. I'm going to call it SDC for SQLDataSource control. I'll make that lowercase. And it's connecting to classes, so I'm going to make it classes. I'm just going to name it. Better to name your controls. And then I'll go over to design, and I'm going to click on my data grid. I'm going to bring up its properties window, hit F4, and now I'm going to bind this SQLDataSource control with its data adapter and its query and its connection. I'm going to bind it to this data grid. And so you see when I click on the data source ID property, it knows already that there's a SQLDataSource control called SDC classes. So I'm going to bind to that control. I'm going to save my work, and now I'm going to view this page in the browser and say yes, save. And when it comes back, eventually, it should show me a list of all of my classes, which it's showing me class ID, title, major ID, seats, start date, in a nice long list here. So that's immediately connecting to my database. So I want to show you one last little thing before we end, and that's about this data grid. And I'm going to set a couple of the properties here. I'm going to go over to the data grid and say allow paging equals true. And I'm going to go down to the property that says page size, and I'm going to say show me 5 at a time, and save it. And I'm going to view the page in the browser again. And now you see that instead of showing me a big long list and my user having to scroll, which may be desirable, you might want them to do that, but now you see I have little paging numbers at the bottom, and if I click 2, it brings me the next 5. If I click 3, the next 5, 4, the last 5. And you can see it's spread out a little more because these are longer and they sort of wrapped around. In addition to that, you can also affect other properties of the data grid. You can, if you click on the Smart tag here, you can auto format it and give it some colors, and it will automatically format it for you. I think I'll choose autumn. Say OK. Let's save. And let's view this in the browser. And now you've got a more colorful data grid. I'm not sure I really like that writing at the top. I want to show you one last thing too in the source. Now if you take a look at the data grid, you can see that all the styling here is here in the source. So if you want to change any of that, so for example, I might want to go in and change in the header the forecolor to something that's a little bit lighter, and I can figure out what I need here and change that if I want to. So that's quick and quick introduction to the SQL data source control and connecting it up with a data grid using what we call complex binding.